everyone, welcome to Your Learn Lab. I am Seema, and if you're an IGNOU student, you're in the right place. Here we create videos on different IGNOU courses to help you ace your exams. So hit subscribe and join me on this learning journey. Today we are doing the second video on MEG-03 Block 3 British novel, Middlemarch by George Eliot. In the last video, we discussed the structure, characters, setting, and the plot of Middlemarch, diving into a broad overview of the major themes running through the novel. In today's session, we are covering some of the most important aspects of Middlemarch that you need to know for your exams. We'll start with the major themes of the novel: ambition, idealism, money, marriage, and social forces. Then we'll look at key character studies: Dorothea, Casaubon, Lydgate, Rosamond, and Will Ladislaw, and see how their lives reflect these themes. We'll also discuss how class, gender, religion, and politics shape the story, and how Eliot uses narrative techniques like mimesis and deigesis. We'll quickly touch on feminist perspectives and Eliot's place in the literary tradition. And finally, we'll see how Middlemarch works as both a realist and subversive novel. Stay tuned till the end. This will give you a full and exam-focused understanding of Middlemarch. So let's get started. Now, reading Middlemarch can feel overwhelming because it's big, detailed, and complex. One way to make it easier is to take notes on the main themes as you read. But remember, many themes overlap and show up across different characters and storylines. Also, George Eliot's characters aren't just symbols for ideas. They're real, complex individuals. A thematic map or chart can help you track everything. But treat it as a flexible tool, not something rigid you must stick to. The themes that we are going to discuss today are the theme of vocation, marital compatibility, money and pecuniary interests, birth, class and rank, politics and reform, science and systems of knowledge, religion, and egotism. These are based on IGNOU's material, and learning this will help you write about the main themes in Middlemarch with examples. Let's start with the first major theme, a vocation, or the idea of a meaningful life purpose. In Middlemarch, Eliot shows how different characters approach this idea in very different ways. Dorothea Brooke dreams of serving society through good works. She yearns for a moral and spiritual mission, believing that true fulfillment lies in helping others. Tertius Lydgate, on the other hand, is driven by scientific ambition. He wants to bring reform to medicine and leave a lasting contribution. But Eliot doesn't romanticize these dreams. She shows how easily they are compromised. Casaubon, who is obsessed with completing his key to all mythologies, never fulfills his intellectual purpose. His vocation becomes a symbol of wasted effort and isolation. Similarly, Bulstrode achieves material success, but it's tainted by moral corruption and hidden guilt. His vocation, outwardly respectable, is inwardly rotten. Even someone like Camden Fairbrother struggles. He is a good-hearted clergyman but faces constant financial instability, reminding us that pursuing one's true calling often comes with real-world sacrifices. In contrast, Mary Garth offers a quieter model of purpose, grounded, steady, practical. She shows that meaningful vocation doesn't have to be grand. It can be lived simply and with integrity. Through these characters, Eliot presents vocation not just as a noble pursuit, but as a constant struggle against social constraints, personal flaws, and the pressures of money and respectability. Let's now move on to the next theme of marital compatibility. In Middlemarch, marriage isn't portrayed as simply a romantic union. Eliot shows that marriage often impacts a person's vocation or life's purpose. A bad marriage can derail ambition, stifle growth, and create deep personal dissatisfaction. Look at Dorothea and Casaubon. Dorothea marries Casaubon believing he is a great intellectual, someone whose life's work she can support and learn from. But soon she realizes that their relationship is cold, emotionally barren, and intellectually limiting. Similarly, Lydgate marries Rosamond thinking she will support him in his scientific ambitions. But Rosamond is more interested in social status and luxury than in supporting Lydgate's medical reforms. Their mismatched expectations cause deep rifts. Characters like Rosamond and Will Ladislaw further highlight the gap between dreams and reality. Rosamond's fantasies about marriage clash sharply with the practical hardships she faces, and Will, who brings emotional warmth and companionship, stands in contrast to Casaubon's emotional coldness. Eliot makes an important point here. It's not just societal pressure that leads to unhappy marriages. Individuals themselves, men and women, often create false ideals and unrealistic expectations that doom their relationships. Middlemarch reminds us that successful marriage requires real understanding, not just idealistic dreams. The next major theme we explore in Middlemarch is the role of money and pecuniary interests, a powerful force that shapes both personality and action. Eliot presents wealth as a very real influence on moral choices, not just a background detail. Take Featherstone, for instance. His entire life is dominated by greed and the manipulation of others for financial gain. In contrast, Nicholas Bulstrode cloaks his past financial corruption under a surface of religious respectability, showing how wealth and moral hypocrisy often go hand in hand. We also see this theme play out through Lydgate. Initially, Lydgate is an idealistic doctor determined to bring modern scientific practices to Middlemarch. However, his marriage to Rosamond Vincy, a woman obsessed with luxury and social advancement, gradually undermines his ideals. Financial strain forces Lydgate to compromise his values, illustrating how economic realities can erode even the strongest professional ambitions. Even Dorothea Brooke, who begins the novel seemingly indifferent to material wealth, finds herself entangled in financial limitations after marrying Casaubon. Her inheritance and its control later becomes a significant part of the conflict involving Will Ladislaw, reminding us that no character is entirely untouched by economic forces. In Middlemarch, Eliot refuses to treat money simply as a symbol. Instead, she portrays it as a tangible, destabilizing force that governs personal decisions, shapes relationships, and lays bare the fragile intersection between ambition, morality, and societal expectation. Now, let's explore another key theme: birth, class, and rank, and how deeply they influence the life of characters in Middlemarch. Although Middlemarch is a small provincial town, the social divisions are sharply felt. Eliot shows us that class is not just about wealth, but about perceptions, expectations, and inherited status. Dorothea's relationship with Will Ladislaw is a prime example. Will, though intellectually capable and morally sound, is seen as a socially inferior person due to his mixed background and a lack of secure inheritance. This growing closeness causes disapproval because it disrupts the expected norms of marriage alliances based on class standing. The Garths and the Vincys further illustrate subtle but important class distinctions. Caleb Garth's family represent modest respectability, valuing hard work, honesty, and education. In contrast, the Vincy family, though wealthier and more socially ambitious, they lack the same solid moral grounding. Their aspirations often make them vulnerable to social pressures. Fred Vincy's story captures the tragic impact of class expectations. Despite his charm and likability, Fred's expensive habits and financial irresponsibility lead to deep disappointment. At one point, he is nearly pushed into a religious vocation, something entirely unsuited to his character, simply because it would offer him social respectability and financial security. Through these narratives, Eliot shows us that class divisions are not merely background details. They're silent but powerful forces that shape ambitions, personal choices, and even future happiness. In Middlemarch, social class doesn't just affect marriage, it influences entire life trajectories. Now, let's move to politics and reforms in Middlemarch. Unlike many historical novels, Eliot doesn't center the story around political uprisings or heroic leaders. Instead, politics operates in the background, subtly but persistently influencing personal and social life. The key historical event, which we talked about in the previous video also, here is the Reform Bill of 1832, which sought to expand the British electorate by giving political representation to fast-growing industrial towns and reducing the overrepresentation of tiny, outdated boroughs. This shift marked a weakening of aristocratic dominance in political affairs and a slow movement towards a more democratic system. In Middlemarch, these big national changes are reflected in small, almost casual ways through the conversations of characters like Mr. Brooks, Sir James Chatham, and Mrs. Cadwallader. They debate the need for reform, but their discussion reveal not passionate activism but cautious self-interest and mild confusion. Eliot's genius lies in showing us that political change is not always dramatic. It often seeps slowly into daily life, shaping opinions, alliances, and opportunities without loud revolutions. Let's move on to the theme of science and systems of knowledge in Middlemarch. Lydgate arrives in Middlemarch as a symbol of scientific advancement. Having studied modern medical techniques in Europe, he represents progress and rationalism. At first, the town welcomes him, intrigued by his new ideas. However, very quickly, traditional figures like Dr. Minchin and Dr. Sprague begin to view him as a threat. His progressive methods challenge the old ways, and in a conservative society like Middlemarch, anything unfamiliar breeds suspicion. Lydgate's downfall is not due to incompetence, but because the community resists change. Eliot shows us how even noble reforms can be crushed by the inertia of traditional society, where innovation is often feared rather than embraced. Next, we turn to religion in Middlemarch. Eliot's own break from church traditions deeply influences the novel's treatment of religion. When she was only 23, Eliot informed her father she would no longer attend church, a decision that left a permanent divide. Later, she even published a controversial work questioning a traditional account of Jesus' life. Interestingly, direct theological debate is mostly absent in Middlemarch. Instead, religion appears through characters like Mr. Cadwallader, who represents a modern Anglican view, and Mr. Tyke, who reflects evangelical zeal. Religion and politics often overlap, showing how belief systems reinforce social structures. Eliot doesn't advocate for any one belief. Instead, she uses irony to question rigid doctrines and highlight the limitations of narrow-minded thinking. In Middlemarch, religious conviction is shown as another complex layer shaping individual and communal life. Finally, let's talk about egotism, an uncomfortable but crucial concept. Traditionally, egotism was seen as sinful pride. You might remember this from religious texts like the Bible or literary classics like Paradise Lost, but modern psychology, especially the work of Freud and Jung, reframes the ego as a necessary part of identity. In Middlemarch, Eliot explores this tension. Dorothea clings to her vision of moral greatness, Rosamund is obsessed with status and appearance, and Lydgate pursues scientific renown. None of them are purely selfish, but each one becomes trapped by their narrow personal ambitions. Their intense inward focus binds them to the broader social consequences of their actions. Eliot shows us that even noble dreams can become dangerous when they ignore the interconnectedness of society's needs. Now that we've outlined the key themes in Middlemarch, let's take a closer look at how George Eliot brings these abstract concepts to life through her characters. The novel's themes, gender roles, social class, and idealism versus reality are not just theoretical discussions. Instead, Eliot explores these ideas by embedding them within her characters' lives, actions, and choices. Characters like Dorothea, Will Ladislaw, and Dr. Casaubon serve as conduits through which we can examine these societal forces more intimately. And by observing their struggles, decisions, and interactions, we can see how deeply these themes affect them on a personal level, which is really essential for you to understand in order to write your answers really well. So let's dive deeper into these connections. Let's begin by exploring Dorothea Brooke, one of the most complex characters in Middlemarch. She represents the idealistic, visionary young woman, someone who yearns for intellectual and moral fulfillment. Dorothea's story begins as an independent tale, which George Eliot then integrates into the broader narrative of Middlemarch. Through her, Eliot explores themes of societal limitations, especially on women, and how these limits clash with Dorothea's lofty aspirations. Dorothea's character is driven by a deep desire to serve others, much like the Saint Teresa figure, someone who sees the world in terms of moral duty and self sacrifice. She wants to make a difference in the world, especially in the lives of the poor and needy. However, her idealism is tempered by the limitations of her surroundings, provincial life, gender restrictions, and societal expectations. This tension between her visionary nature and the reality she faces forms the central theme of the novel. Book 1 of Middlemarch begins with an epigraph from Beaumont and Fletcher's The Maid's Page. It conveys a grim view. Since I can do no good because I am a woman, echoing the societal belief that women's potential is inherently limited. This perception is central to Dorothea's character. She aspires to greatness, but society constrains her, placing her in a position where her contributions are undervalued simply because of her gender. This early reference sets the stage for exploring Dorothea's struggle with these gender limitations. Now, Dorothea's views on marriage are heavily influenced by her idealism. She imagines a perfect marriage as one in which her husband functions as a father figure, guiding her intellectually, teaching her languages like Hebrew. This reflects a childlike understanding of marriage, where she seeks not equality but guidance and intellectual fulfillment. However, this perspective reveals a naivety, as real marriage in Middlemarch is more about navigating societal roles and restrictions, particularly for women. However, Eliot's portrayal of Dorothea carries the tragic irony. She is presented as someone whose idealism for greatness and intellectual fulfillment is constantly thwarted by the reality of the provincial world she inhabits. She desires to do good, to be great, but she finds herself trapped by the limitations of class and gender. The tragic irony here is that Dorothea's desires for a meaningful life are ultimately crushed by these societal forces, leading her to become a martyr, but not in a noble sense. Instead, she becomes a victim of a system that does not allow her to flourish. The narrator's ironic tone throughout the novel encourages readers to engage with Dorothea's character more critically. According to Stanley Fish's reader response theory, the meaning of a text is not just something extracted from words, but something that is actively created by the reader's interpretation. And as we read Middlemarch, we are encouraged to question the societal constraints placed on Dorothea and challenge the gendered expectations of her time. The reader response approach allows us to explore alternative readings of Dorothea's character and limits imposed on her by society. So, talking about Dorothea's character, one of the key themes is how gender and class limit her potential. As a woman, her idealism is viewed with skepticism by society. She faces gendered expectations that dictate her role in marriage, family, and society. Her aspirations for intellectual fulfillment and moral greatness are constantly undermined by the roles she's supposed to play. The institution of marriage, as we just discussed itself, also portrayed as a restrictive force, especially for women, as it curtails their ability to pursue their own dreams and intellectual ambitions. In conclusion, Dorothea Brooke's story in Middlemarch represents the tragic clash between an idealistic, visionary woman and the societal forces that constrain her. Through her character, Eliot critiques the limitations placed on women, particularly in relation to marriage and gendered expectations. Dorothea's fate serves as a larger commentary on the struggle of women in Victorian society, showing how their potential can be stifled by social, cultural, and gender-based restrictions. Now, let's turn our attention to the unsuitable suitor, Dr. Casaubon, who is almost 27 years older than Dorothea. His courtship is, without a doubt, one of the driest and most unromantic we encounter in literary history. In chapter 5, Casaubon's letter of proposal to Dorothea is written in a cold, controlled tone where he speaks of her elevation of thought and her capacity for devotion. This starkly contrasts Dorothea's idealized notions of marriage as she envisions a life of intellectual partnership, serving as his aide and devoted wife. There's an eerie disconnect here as Dorothea sees compatibility, whereas readers we can begin to see the trouble that lies ahead. Dorothea, with her idealized view of marriage, falls prey to the vision of intellectual union with Casaubon. She believes that a marriage grounded in higher duties will deliver her from her ignorance. She dreams of being his intellectual companion and supporting his academic work, but she fails to recognize the coldness of Casaubon's approach. There's no mention of emotional warmth, of physical intimacy, or even practical matters of married life. Dorothea's view of marriage is purely theoretical, which makes her vulnerable to Casaubon's emotionally barren offer. This marks the first of many contradictions in Dorothea's character. As readers, we are immediately wary of this relationship. Casaubon presents an ideal that seems more theoretical than practical. Dorothea sees a perfect intellectual match, but we see the red flags. Casaubon's intellectual project, writing the key to all mythologies, is met with indifference by everyone around him, including his family. There's no evidence to support his supposed brilliance, and his work seems like a farce. The union that Dorothea hopes for is not based on a realistic foundation, but rather on a fantasy of intellectual compatibility. We, as readers, know this ideal marriage will crumble under the weight of real-world expectations. In stark contrast to Dorothea's idealism, we have a sister Celia, who is a practical and materialistic character. While Dorothea dreams of a higher intellectual life, Celia finds pleasure in the tangible, fine clothes, jewels, and enjoying her youth. George Eliot uses this contrast effectively to highlight Dorothea's more self-deluded approach. Celia, although seemingly superficial, is not portrayed negatively by Eliot. Rather, her materialism serves as a counterpoint to Dorothea's more abstract and idealistic worldview. One of the most striking moments in the text comes when Dorothea encounters her mother's jewels. She is immediately drawn to their beauty but feels uncomfortable with her attraction to material things. She quickly justifies her fascination by invoking spirituality, claiming that the gems are symbols of heaven. This moment is a vivid example of Dorothea's internal contradictions. She attempts to reconcile her idealized self-image as an intellectually and morally superior person with her material desires. In doing so, she self-deceives and deflects any admission of self-interest. And moving on, Dorothea is also blind to her own contradictions, and this moral blindness leads her to underestimate the complexities of marriage. Her naivety about herself and the world of relationship is pretty evident, and she projects herself as a woman with high ideals, yet her action and desire are far more grounded in the material world than she is willing to admit, though. This gap between her idealized self and her actual self will cause her much suffering as the novel progresses. As time progresses, experiences reveal the tragic discrepancy between Dorothea's intentions and her abilities. Finally, let's consider Cadwallader's sharp critique of Casaubon. He describes him as a bladder for dried peas, a humorous but revealing metaphor. This image highlights Casaubon's emptiness, his lack of vitality, and his inability to connect with the real world beyond his intellectual pursuits. It underscores the unsuitability of Casaubon as a husband for Dorothea. Meanwhile, Celia, in her more pragmatic and grounded way, privately reflects on Dorothea's inconsistencies. Her idealism often does not match her reality. So far, we've looked at Middlemarch's major themes: vocation, marriage, money, class, politics, science, religion, egotism, and how George Eliot carefully weaves these ideas into her characters' personal lives. But Eliot doesn't stop at portraying individual struggles. Starting from chapter 15, she deliberately expands the scope of the novel. Instead of following just Dorothea, Lydgate, or Casaubon, Eliot begins to interlace many lives together, showing us how private destinies are connected to larger social and economic forces. So let's explore how Middlemarch grows from personal stories into a richly interconnected web of human life. Let's begin by zooming out from Dorothea and Casaubon's private world. Chapter 15 is a deliberate turning point in Middlemarch. Eliot opens up the novel's narrative lens to show us that no story unfolds in a vacuum. Now, as I take you into this chapter, I want you to notice something important: the metaphor of the web. Eliot doesn't just use it for the poetic effect. This web is her model of human life, interconnected, sticky, and full of unintended consequences. It's a way of telling us that character is not just internal, it's systemic. And this matters because from here onward, the novel stops being about one storyline and becomes a moral and emotional network, something that Barbara Hardy beautifully calls the geometry of Middlemarch. We'll now see how individual destinies are inseparable from the ideological and economic structures they live within. Now that we've set up the idea of the narrative web, let's look at how Eliot begins to stage that complexity. Chapter 15's dinner party at Mr. Brooks' house is a masterclass in narrative design. If you've ever read Chaucer, think of this moment as the Tabard Inn of Middlemarch. Eliot gathers her characters like a storyteller, preparing her pilgrims, and we get our first real glimpse of the town's ideological spectrum. As I walk you through the guests, I want you to notice the careful balance Eliot strikes. You've got the landed gentry, religious figures, reformists, and outliers, Lydgate, Bulstrode, and Fairbrother. These are not just people chatting over wine, they're positions in a debate. This is how Eliot introduces her ideas, not abstractly, but through character, through setting, through subtext. And through that, she invites us to think of Middlemarch not as a backdrop, but as a living system. From that dinner party, one figure emerges whose trajectory echoes the major themes we've already seen. Tertius Lydgate. Lydgate arrives in Middlemarch with grand hopes. He dreams of reforming medicine, contributing to science, and steering clear of provincial entanglements. But Eliot places him at a dangerous fault line between Enlightenment, rationalism, and Middlemarch's deep-rooted conservatism. His tragedy will not be personal failure, but systemic absorption. The web traps him, professionally through Bulstrode's financial support and personally through his marriage to Rosamond. Through Lydgate, Eliot critiques how structures, social decorum, gender expectations, financial pressures can sabotage even the most sincere reformist ideals. Parallel to Lydgate's intellectual frustrations is Dorothea's emotional starvation. And that's where Will Ladislaw enters. Will's light is not just poetic, it's thematic. Dorothea, trapped in a marriage that suppresses her mind and spirit, finds in Will a renewed intellectual and emotional energy. He is politically progressive, aesthetically sensitive, and emotionally perceptive. However, Eliot does not rush their relationship. She builds it with care and nuance, showing how affection rooted in mutual recognition grows quietly under the weight of social constraint. Will becomes the novel's embodied critique of spiritual sterility, offering a glimpse of connection without domination, something deeply radical for the Victorian world Eliot depicts. As we widen our lens even further, another key figure demands our attention: Nicholas Bulstrode. Bulstrode is not just another character, he becomes a test case for Eliot's exploration of hypocrisy. He believes he is doing God's work, yet his wealth stems from morally dubious sources. Through multi-perspective narration, Eliot shows us how Bulstrode views himself, which is righteous, how others view him, which is morally austere, and how the narrator subtly exposes his self-deception. His eventual collapse will show you how fragile moral pretension is in a world driven by appearances and commerce. Bulstrode's story invites us to reflect on the persistent gap between intention and action, a central ethical tension throughout the novel. Now let's pause and take a step back. Why has Eliot brought all these characters together at this point in the story? Because Middlemarch is not merely a collection of individual tales. It is a novel about interconnected lives, about how people's ambitions, dreams, failures, and compromises form a dense social fabric. Dorothea's spiritual yearnings, Will's political marginality, Lydgate's scientific hopes, Bulstrode's hidden guilt, all these strands are enmeshed in a web of forces that both enable and constrain them. This is the philosophical core of Middlemarch, that moral life is communal, and that history is not shaped by grand battles, but by the slow frictional rubbing of ordinary lives against one another. So, why have I walked you through these characters and this chapter structure in such detail? Because Eliot isn't just telling us about Dorothy or Lydgate, she's training us to think relationally. In a world obsessed with individualism, Middlemarch offers a different model, that we are all part of intersecting forces, that character is shaped by context, and that moral growth depends on seeing beyond ourselves. When we study Middlemarch, we are studying how literature teaches us to read complexity, to analyze systems, and to recognize that the ethical life is a social one. In the previous sections, we explored the intricate lives of individual characters. Now we broaden our focus to examine how Middlemarch engages with the larger literary tradition. The title of the book, too, Old and Young, shifts the narrative from an individual focus to a broader examination of contrasting groups. This group-centered approach provides us with valuable insights into Eliot's narrative craft, and chapter 15 in particular serves as a critical moment when Eliot reflects on her role as a novelist within the English literary tradition. Here she acknowledges the influence of Henry Fielding, the author of Tom Jones, whose preface to Tom Jones enunciated the theory of a comic epic in prose. Fielding's picaresque novel adopts a freewheeling narrative that embodies a sense of freedom largely available to male characters and male authors. Eliot, in contrast, places herself among belated historians focusing on unraveling specific human lives, each one a particular web rather than seeking to present the universe as Fielding did. This distinction is significant, particularly when considering Eliot's own narrative strategy and the limitations imposed by society, especially on female writers. Now that we've seen how George Eliot challenges traditional narrative structures and expands the scope of the realist novel, it's equally important to see where she fits within the broader literary tradition, especially from a feminist perspective. So, as we move into feminist perspectives on Middlemarch, it's important to bring in Elaine Showalter's influential work, A Literature of Their Own. Showalter traces how women writers historically created a parallel literary tradition alongside the male-dominated canon. Jane Austen is a key early example. She famously described her writings as a fine painting on 2 inches of ivory, emphasizing the delicate but confined domestic world women could portray. Her novels, though rich in detail, reflect the narrow social spaces women were allowed to explore. In contrast, George Eliot, especially in Middlemarch, breaks his mold. She moves beyond the domestic sphere, writing about politics, science, reform, and the broader structures of society. Eliot's scope shows that women could tackle larger, complex subjects traditionally reserved for male authors. Even though Eliot rarely addresses gender outright, her references to the light I can command is a quiet acknowledgement of the limits placed on women writers. Yet, at the same time, it's also an assertion of her ambition to overcome those restrictions. Through Middlemarch, Eliot challenges traditional narrative boundaries and expands what the realist novel and women writers could achieve. After seeing how Eliot challenged the boundaries of what women could write about, it's important to understand the strategies she used to carve her space in the male-dominated literary world. Mary Ann Evans adopted the pen name George Eliot to navigate societal biases. At the time, women writers were often expected to produce sentimental or domestic fiction, and their work was rarely seen as intellectually serious. By choosing a male pseudonym, Eliot could access critical authority and address major subjects like politics, science, and industrial progress, topics traditionally reserved for men. Realism itself was crucial to this strategy. In the 19th century, realism was considered the most serious and respectable literary form. In contrast, genres often associated with women like gothic fiction or highly emotional narratives, they were marginalized. Critics dismissed works like those of the Bronte sisters as overly passionate or sensational, though later readings revealed their profound psychological insight. By mastering realism in Middlemarch, Eliot not only ensured her place in the literary canon, but also subtly expanded the boundaries of women's authorship. Her work demonstrated that women could write about full range of human experience, challenging both literary and societal expectations. Building on what we discussed about Eliot's use of realism and her literary strategy, we now come to an important subversive gesture she makes in Middlemarch. In the opening paragraph of chapter 15, Eliot subtly but powerfully invokes the tradition of the British novel, referencing Henry Fielding's Tom Jones, a work seen as pinnacle of a free, expansive male narrative tradition. Fielding's style represented a kind of storytelling freedom that was largely reserved for male authors. But Eliot uses this reference to reposition herself. She suggests that the novel has evolved and that it is no longer confined to the adventurous tales of men, but has expanded to include careful unraveling of human lives, particularly lives shaped and limited by social structures. Through Middlemarch, Eliot shows that women writers too can claim the right to address serious complex subjects like politics, science, religion, and reform, areas traditionally excluded from what was considered women's writing. Her narrative strategy is not openly confrontational, but it's deeply subversive. By crafting a work that embraces the full spectrum of human experience, Eliot challenges the gendered limits of literary tradition and expands the possibilities available to women writers. With Eliot's subversive move in broadening the scope of the novel, it becomes equally important to understand the techniques she used to create such a layered and complex narrative structure. Now let's shift our focus to two key concepts that help us appreciate how Middlemarch is crafted: mimesis and diegesis. David Lodge, adapting ideas originally found in Plato's works, explains how narrative can alternate between these two modes. Mimesis is the technique of direct representation. It shows events through dialogue, actions, and character interactions, almost like a dramatic scene unfolding before the reader. Diegesis, by contrast, is the author's narration or commentary, where the narrator steps in to explain, interpret, or reflect on what the character themselves might not fully understand. In Middlemarch, George Eliot masterfully blends both. Through mimesis, she gives life to her characters' conversation and emotional struggles, making them feel immediate and real. At the same time, her diegetic commentary adds layers of psychological and ethical insight, helping readers see not just what happens, but why it matters in a broader moral and social context. This balance between showing and telling allows Eliot to create a novel that feels both dramatically alive and intellectually profound, a hallmark of her realist art. To conclude, Middlemarch is not just an outstanding example of realistic fiction. It's also George Eliot's quiet yet powerful rebellion against literary and social norms. Eliot masterfully blends mimesis and diegesis to create rich, layered narrative, and by adopting a male pseudonym and writing about subjects like politics, science, and societal reform, she broke through gendered restrictions and asserted that women writers too could engage with the broader intellectual debates of their time. So, when you prepare for your exams, make sure to highlight how Eliot both participates in and expands the realist tradition, using both her narrative techniques and her thematic choices to subvert the boundaries traditionally placed on women authors. Middlemarch is a novel that not only mirrors Victorian society, but also helps reshape the literary possibilities for future generations. When you prepare for your exams, remember to emphasize how Eliot's thematic concerns and narrative strategies both participate in and expand the literary tradition of our era. That brings us to the end of our video 2 for Middlemarch, covering Unit 2 from Block 5 of MEG-03. In the next few videos, we will be covering remaining units to help you ace the exam. Let us know in the comments which other topics you would like for us to cover soon. If you found this video helpful and would like to learn more, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to your Learn Lab. See you in the next one. Until then, happy learning.